Hey guys! Tonight, we're diving into history's forgotten killers. Not the dramatic battlefields that fill our textbooks, but the quiet, ordinary workplaces that silently claimed millions of lives across centuries. You're standing in a dimly lit workshop in 17th century Venice, watching as an artisan carefully pours a silvery flowing metal across a perfectly flat glass surface. The mercury spreads like living water, creating what will become a flawless mirror, an object of extraordinary beauty and status. What you don't see are the invisible vapors rising from the quicksilver, gradually infiltrating the worker's nervous system, causing tremors in his hands that he attributes to age rather than poison. Given the mortality rates in these workshops, you probably wouldn't survive 5 years in this profession, though your exquisite mirrors would grace palaces. Long after your trembling body was lowered into an unmarked grave. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The silent killers revealed in mirror-making workshops represent just one example of how ordinary occupations have claimed more lives throughout history than all wars combined. A staggering truth that rarely makes it into our historical narratives. You re-witnessing one of civilization's deadly paradoxes? The very technologies and crafts that advanced human progress often killed those who made them possible. Mirror-making stands as a perfect example of this lethal contradiction. You're now moving through a Venetian mirror factory, circa 1650. Observing the complete process that transformed Venice into Europe's mirror-making capital and its workers into the walking dead. The first stage involves glass blowers creating perfectly flat glass sheets, already a dangerous task that exposes workers to extreme heat, toxic fumes, and the risk of devastating fires. But the truly deadly work begins in the silvering department, where the actual mirrors are created. You watch as workers carefully pour liquid mercury onto tinfoil laid over flat glass. The mercury and tin form an amalgam that adheres to the glass, creating a reflective surface of unprecedented clarity. What makes this process so lethal is mercury's unique property of vaporizing at room temperature. As you observe the workshop, invisible poisonous fumes fill the air with every breath. The workers, mostly men, but sometimes women and even children, absorb this neurotoxin through their lungs, skin, and even eye membranes. Within months, many develop the telltale symptoms: trembling hands, slurred speech, irritability, and eventually, madness. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the devastation is the documented lifespan of Venetian mirror workers. Records from the 17th century show that professional mirror makers in Venice rarely survived beyond 40, with many dying in their 30s from what was euphemistically called mirror disease. The symptoms we now recognize as classic mercury poisoning were so common among these artisans that trembling hands became considered an occupational badge of sorts, a grim professional marker indicating years of experience. The economic dynamics made this situation particularly tragic. Venice guarded its mirror-making techniques as valuable state secrets, threatening death to any artisan who shared these methods with foreigners. You re-witnessing the irony of this policy? The secrets were protected with death threats, while the process itself delivered the same outcome more slowly. When French spies eventually stole these techniques in the late 17th century, they unknowingly exported both the coveted craftsmanship and its deadly consequences. A particularly quirky tidbit about mirror making emerges as you speak with a master craftsman. He explains the widespread belief that mercury exposure could be countered by consuming large quantities of garlic and wine, a protective measure that workers faithfully followed. Some shops even provided free wine rations, believing it helped flush toxins from the body. This folk remedy, while completely ineffective against mercury poisoning, at least offered workers some small pleasure as their nervous systems gradually deteriorated. Modern toxicologists note with dark humor that the alcohol likely just masked the early symptoms, allowing workers to continue poisoning themselves for longer before becoming too impaired to work. The mirror workshops weren't limited to Venice. You're now traveling across Europe to other mirror-making centers in France, England, and Germany, finding similar conditions everywhere. The French Royal Mirror works at St. Gobain, established in 1665. It became particularly notorious for worker mortality. Louis XIV's insatiable demand for mirrors to decorate his palace of Versailles, including the famous Hall of Mirrors with its 357 mirrors, was essentially a death sentence for hundreds of artisans. Next time you admire historical mirrors in museums or palaces, you're looking at objects that almost certainly claimed lives in their creation. Historians still argue whether governments and workshop owners were genuinely ignorant of mercury's dangers, or simply considered worker deaths an acceptable cost of production. You find evidence supporting both positions. Some medical texts from as early as the 16th century clearly described mercury's harmful effects, suggesting informed negligence. Yet other records show workshop owners themselves often died from the same conditions, suggesting they may not have fully understood the invisible killer in their midst. The truth likely varies by time and place, with knowledge gradually accumulating but profit motives consistently outweighing safety concerns. By the mid-19th century, mirror-making technology finally began shifting away from mercury, as silver nitrate processes were developed that could create reflective surfaces without the deadly quicksilver. You're standing in an early silver nitrate mirror factory, noting how this chemical innovation saved countless lives while creating mirrors of equal or better quality. This transition didn't happen because of humanitarian concerns for workers, but rather because the new process proved more economical. A pattern we LLC repeatedly in the gradual elimination of deadly occupations. The last mercury mirror factory didn't close until the early 20th century, marking the end of an art that, while creating objects of extraordinary beauty, left behind a trail of trembling, maddened bodies that far outnumbered casualties of many famous battles. You're holding a single drop of mercury in your palm, marveling at how this liquid metal refuses to be absorbed by your skin, instead forming a perfect silvery bead that rolls and dances with the slightest movement. Quicksilver's deadly embrace seems almost the ancient alchemists weren't wrong to be fascinated by mercury's unique properties, but they severely underestimated its dangers. That playful droplet in your hand is actively releasing invisible vapors that pass through your skin, bypass the blood-brain barrier, and begin systematically destroying your nervous system. The fascinating properties that made mercury indispensable to countless industries, its liquid state at room temperature, its ability to amalgamate with other metals, its perfect reflectivity, are inseparable from its lethal nature. Magical, a metal that flows like water yet weighs 13.5 times more, that can shatter into countless droplets and then seamlessly recombine. This amalgam would later be heated, vaporizing the mercury and leaving behind pure gold or silver. And gingivitis, then the tremors beginning in the hands before spreading throughout the body, followed by personality changes, irritability, memory problems. The process was ingenious, efficient, and extraordinarily deadly. Despite this clinical knowledge, effective protective measures remained virtually non-existent across most mercury-using industries. Workers continued handling mercury with bare hands, breathing its vapors, and even consuming it through contaminated food well into the 20th century. You're now in the laboratory of a 19th century chemist, watching as he uses mercury in experiments that will eventually expand human knowledge. Scientists like Michael Faraday regularly handled mercury in developing electrical components and studying chemical properties. You're observing workers in a mercury-using facility over months, watching their personalities gradually transform. Once jovial individuals become irritable and withdrawn, confident workers develop anxiety and insecurity. Clear thinkers become confused and forgetful. You find evidence for both positions. Internal industry documents, sometimes acknowledging health risks while publicly denying them, but also genuine scientific uncertainty about exact exposure thresholds and mechanisms of harm. What's clear is that economic considerations consistently outweighed health concerns. You're listening to a mercury miner in Spain describe his symptoms to a doctor in 1850, attributing his tremors to bad air in the mines and his mental confusion to stress or perhaps a curse. Without understanding the invisible enemy they faced, workers across dozens of industries developed superstitions and folk remedies: drinking milk, eating garlic, wearing amulets, none of which offered real protection. This invisible killer moved through history largely unrecognized, claiming countless lives while hiding behind symptoms that were easy to attribute to other causes. When alternatives to mercury-based processes were eventually adopted, the motivation typically came from economic efficiency rather than worker safety. You're reviewing fragmentary records from mercury mines, mirror factories, hat-making workshops, chemical plants, and dozens of other industries, finding consistent patterns mercury killed subtly. Over time, its victims often dying from secondary causes like respiratory infections after their immune systems were compromised, or from accidents caused by tremors and confusion. Without modern diagnostic techniques or occupational health tracking, most mercury victims simply vanished into history's margins, their suffering unrecorded except as vague references to trade diseases or premature aging. What's certain is that across centuries and continents, mercury's deadly embrace claimed far more lives than many famous military conflicts, a silent industrial war fought without recognition or memorials. The human cost was consistently treated as a secondary consideration at best. This constellation of psychological symptoms known as erethism often proved more debilitating than the physical tremors. Victims experienced what felt like a betrayal of their own minds, often aware enough to recognize their deterioration, but powerless to stop it. The psychological horror of mercury poisoning informed cultural touchstones, like many suffered the consequences. Faraday himself experienced health problems later in life that some historians attribute to mercury exposure. The very substance helping reveal nature's secrets was simultaneously destroying the minds trying to understand them. Mercury-filled workers regularly breathed mercury vapors, handled it with bare hands, and even consumed it through contaminated food and water. Photographers used mercury vapors to develop daguerreotypes, the first commercially successful photographic process. You're watching a photographer heat mercury in an enclosed box with the exposed photographic plate. As he opens the box to check the image, he directly inhales the concentrated mercury vapors. Many early photographers suffered severe mercury poisoning. With some studios, Spanish colonial records document the horrific mortality rates at these facilities, where indigenous laborers often survived only a few years of work. You're now touring a 19th century thermometer factory, watching workers skillfully fill glass tubes with precisely measured amounts of mercury. You're now standing in a Spanish colonial mercury processing facility in Huancavelica, Peru, where mercury was used to extract precious metals through amalgamation. Miners would crush gold or silver or then mix it with these early martyrs to photography, left behind hauntingly beautiful images, while their own minds and bodies deteriorated from their invisible chemical exposure. Mercury's unique position on the periodic table made it simultaneously invaluable and deadly across dozens of industries. What makes mercury particularly insidious is that, unlike many industrial toxins that cause immediate, obvious reactions, mercury poisoning accumulates gradually. The workers around you are literally carrying their executioner within their bodies, where mercury atoms are actively binding to sulfur-containing enzymes and proteins, disrupting cellular function throughout their bodies. The room is warm and poorly ventilated, and you notice how many employees display the characteristic tremors of chronic mercury exposure. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates mercury's industrial importance was its crucial role in gold and silver mining from the 16th through 19th centuries. Mercury, which bound with the precious metals to form an amalgam. The medical understanding of mercury poisoning evolved painfully slowly. You're sitting in on a medical lecture in Paris circa 1800. Where a physician describes the progressive symptoms. First, the excessive salivation, depression, and ultimately, in severe cases, full-blown psychosis. What contemporary observers often described as madness. A particularly quirky tidbit about mercury emerges as you visit a 19th century photography studio. It's featuring a macabre joke that the trade guaranteed pictures that would last longer than the photographer. Mercury's role in scientific advancement created a terrible irony. Barometers, manometers, diffusion pumps, and countless other scientific instruments, making it nearly unavoidable in academic and industrial laboratories before safer alternatives were developed. The psychological effects of mercury poisoning were perhaps its most disturbing aspect. Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter, a character inspired by the real condition of hat makers poisoned through their trade. Historians still argue whether mercury's dangers were actively suppressed by industries profiting from its use or simply accepted as an inevitable cost of technological advancement. What makes mercury particularly tragic from a historical perspective is how many of its victims never understood what was killing them. The full scale of mercury's historical death toll will never be known with certainty, of premature death and disability, but rarely direct acknowledgement of the cause. You're peering through the grimy window of a hat-making workshop in Victorian London, watching a middle-aged man struggle to control his violently shaking hands as he applies mercury nitrate solution to rabbit fur. Mad Hatters weren't fiction, and the scene unfolding before you reveals the grim reality behind Lewis Carroll's famous character. The tremors are just the beginning. The Hatteras colleagues display various stages of Hatteras disease, some slurring their words, despite being stone-cold sober, others exhibiting bizarre mood swings, flying from manic laughter to tearful despair within minutes. The most affected sit in corners, their vacant stares and drooling mouths indicating the final stages of neurological devastation. You're examining a standard hat-making facility, noting the low ceilings, poor ventilation, and crowded conditions. Hatters typically worked, and you're following a young apprentice hatter through his career, watching the symptoms emerge and intensify. Initially, there's just occasional clumsiness, dropped tools, spilled solutions, easily attributed to fatigue or carelessness. Within a few years, persistent tremors develop. Beginning in the hands, and the workshop foreman casually mentions they'll be sent to the poorhouse soon, so they can no longer perform even the simplest tasks. Psychological changes emerge next: irritability, depression, pathological shyness, and unpredictable mood swings. This cultural normalization helped perpetuate mercury use in hat making, as the public viewed hatters' symptoms as an amusing occupational quirk rather than preventable poisoning. You're visiting a women's hat finishing department where female workers add decorative elements to completed hats. While men typically performed the initial mercury-intensive processes, women and children often worked with mercury-contaminated materials in later production stages. You find contradictory evidence across different times and regions. French physicians documented Hatter's disease as early as the 1730s, clearly connecting it to mercury exposure. By the mid-19th century, medical literature explicitly recognized the occupational hazard, yet regulations came painfully slowly. You're comparing three different hat manufacturing facilities: a luxury hat maker serving aristocratic clients, a middle market operation producing affordable hats for the bourgeoisie, and a basement workshop churning out cheap products for working class consumers. This pattern, where the poorest workers suffered the most extreme exposure, repeated across the industry, concentrating mercury's devastation among those with the least political voice to demand change. The luxury operation, while still using mercury, employs better ventilation and assigns different workers to various stages, limiting individual exposure. Mercury hat making eventually ended, not primarily from safety regulations, but because forefelting processes themselves became obsolete as consumer preferences shifted toward different hat styles and materials. A pattern we see repeatedly, where technological change accomplished what health advocacy alone could not. The basement workshop operating on razor-thin margins. America didn't ban mercury in hat making until 1941, following decades of labor activism, and female hatters frequently brought work home, exposing entire families to mercury vapors. You re-attending a 1912 occupational health conference, where doctors present unambiguous evidence linking mercury to hatter symptoms. Industry representatives acknowledge the connection, but argue that improved ventilation and worker hygiene practices are sufficient, refusing to consider eliminating mercury despite known alternatives. This resistance to fundamental change, even when faced with overwhelming evidence, this timeline suggests that knowledge existed long before action was taken, though whether this represents deliberate suppression or mere indifference remains debated. Most devastating were the reproductive consequences. Pregnant hatters experienced high rates of memory problems follow, with the hatter forgetting long-practiced techniques. In advanced cases, hallucinations occur, along with full psychosis. Mercury easily crosses the placental barrier, poisoning developing fetuses even when mothers showed only mild symptoms. This intergenerational poisoning meant that Hatting's death toll extended beyond the workers themselves to include children never given the chance to live healthy lives. By his late 30s, the once skilled craftsman can barely function, displaying the constellation of neurological and psychological symptoms that became so notorious they entered the popular lexicon as mad as a hatter. A new batch of eager young apprentices has just arrived, blissfully unaware they're viewing their own futures in these shattered men. You re-observing hatters engage in what contemporaries called hatter's language, a form of gibberish speech that resulted from the hat-making process that created these. This phenomenon became so common that many assumed it was a secretive trade dialect rather than a symptom of brain damage. Similarly, the distinctive gait many hatters developed, a twitchy, shuffling walk, was often mistaken for an affected mannerism rather than neurological impairment. These misconceptions contributed to the cultural stereotype of hatters as merely eccentric rather than victims of industrial poisoning. Mad Hatters began with a seemingly simple chemical innovation. You're re-attending a reading of Lewis Carroll S. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Shortly after its 1865 publication, noting how the audience laughs at the mercury poisoned, Hatter's erratic behavior, bizarre speech, and mood swings. The character was instantly recognizable to Victorian readers who were familiar with real hatters exhibiting these. You're watching the initial stage, where hatters brush mercury nitrate solution onto animal furs, typically rabbit, beaver, or hare. This process, called carroting due to the orange-red color it produced, roughened the small barbs on the animal hairs, making them mat together more effectively during the felting process. Many operations occurred with heated mercury solutions, significantly increasing vaporization. Workers routinely handled mercury-treated materials with bare hands for 12 to 16-hour shifts. It's often eating at their workstations, inadvertently ingesting mercury alongside their meals. These conditions remained standard across Europe and America well into the 19th century, creating perfect environments for maximum mercury exposure across generations of workers. The innovation revolutionized hat making, creating smoother, more durable felt, while significantly reducing production time. This mercurial solution was nothing short of miraculous from a manufacturing perspective, and absolutely devastating from a human one. One mainstream historical fact that made hatters particularly vulnerable was the typical workshop environment, closed spaces where mercury vapors concentrated to dangerous levels. The progression of hatters' shakes followed a horrifically predictable pattern, eventually spreading to the entire body. Speech becomes slurred, making the hatter sound perpetually drunk. A particularly quirky tidbit about hatters involves their peculiar occupational behaviors that outsiders mistook for eccentricity rather than poisoning. Damage affecting language centers. The cultural immortalization of the Mad Hatter reveals much about Victorian attitudes toward occupational disease. Same symptoms. What's disturbing is how this suffering was transformed into comedy. The Hatter-esque medical condition repackaged as amusing lunacy without acknowledgement of its industrial cause. The gender dimensions of hatting reveal a particularly tragic pattern: miscarriage, stillbirth, and children born with neurological defects. Historians still argue whether the hat industry actively suppressed knowledge about mercury dangers or simply ignored evidence that threatened profits. Public health campaigns, British and European restrictions came even later in some regions. The economic stratification of hat making meant that mercury's victims were primarily working class, making their suffering easier to ignore. Cuts every possible safety corner, with workers performing all mercury-intensive processes in cramped, unventilated spaces. By the early 20th century, scientific evidence about mercury's dangers had become impossible to ignore, Yet change came with agonizing slowness, characterized many deadly industries throughout history. You're descending into the suffocating darkness of Spain's infamous mercury mine that operated continuously for over 2,000 years. Mining's lethal legacy surrounds you in this hellscape that claimed more lives than any battlefield of its era. A sudden fit of coughing from a nearby miner spatters the rock wall with blood-tinged sputum. The overseer barely glances at the man, who struggles to regain his breath. Longevity isn't expected here. Physical dangers were equally severe. Cave-ins, flooding, and falls claimed countless lives. But most insidious was the mercury vapor released when ore was heated to extract the metal, creating concentrations of airborne mercury hundreds of times above fatal levels. When convict labor proved insufficient, slaves and indigenous workers were conscripted. The primitive condensation systems failed to capture significant amounts of vaporized mercury, creating a toxic fog that workers breathe continuously. Their tasks require them to collect the condensed mercury by hand, often splashing the liquid metal on their skin or clothes. Most devastating is the cleaning of condensation chambers, where the Spanish Empire's silver production in the Americas, which relied on mercury for processing, created such demand that workforce was constantly replenished with new bodies as workers succumbed to poisoning, accidents, and disease. You're now traveling to Huancavelica in Peru, where Spanish colonizers established mercury mines to support silver extraction throughout the Americas. The mortality rates here exceeded, even with indigenous workers dying so rapidly that nearby villages were depopulated. Colonial records document administrators' frustration with constantly needing to conscript new workers as the previous ones died. You continue to Igreja in present-day Slovenia, another major mercury producer, where generations of families experience the same progression of symptoms, creating communities where you find evidence for both positions. You're examining soil and water samples from areas surrounding historical mercury mining operations, finding concentrations that remain toxic centuries later. Mercury's environmental persistence means that mining activities from the Roman era still poison. Modern communities living near ancient sites, you're following Mercury's journey from two colonial silver mines in Peru and Mexico, where it enabled the massive silver extraction that funded European empires. Without mercury, the Spanish colonial economy would have collapsed. Yet the workers who produced this essential material remained historical footnotes. This pattern, where the most essential materials for economic advancement are often produced through the most destructive labor, repeats throughout industrial history. Mercury mining represented not an aberration, but rather an extreme example of how progress has frequently been built upon concealed human sacrifice, with workers' bodies as the foundation for economic advancement. The Roman mercury mines, at contaminated ecosystems that remain toxic today, creating an environmental death toll that continues long after the mines themselves closed. Modern researchers have documented elevated mercury levels in current residents of these regions, showing how industrial poison transcends generations, creating a mortality impact impossible to fully quantify, but certainly exceeding the already staggering direct worker deaths. Even ancient Romans documented mercury's dangers, with the naturalist Pliny the Elder noting that mercury miners were given pig bladders to breathe through as primitive respirators. This suggests some awareness of inhalation risks. Conversely, effective mercury vapor control required technological innovations that simply didn't exist until recent centuries. The truth likely combines both factors. While complete safety was technically impossible, available knowledge could have reduced mortality had human lives been valued above production quotas. Workers absorbed this poison through lungs, skin, and even eyes, guaranteeing systemic toxic exposure, regardless of assigned tasks. Most last 3 years, he tells you with clinical detachment. You're reviewing labor systems across different mining regions, noting how work was frequently allocated along ethnic, racial, or class lines. At Moriscos were often assigned the most dangerous tasks. In colonial operations, indigenous peoples and African slaves performed the deadliest work, while European overseers maintained distance from the worst exposures. Even in later periods when wage labor replaced forced labor, economic desperation rather than physical coercion drove workers into these deadly mines. The poorest, most marginalized communities provided the expendable bodies that kept these processing workers typically showed symptoms more quickly than miners, their neurological systems ravaged by concentrated exposure. You're watching a foreman examine a young worker who's been in the mines for 6 months. He has the boy open his mouth to check for excessive salivation, one of mercury poisoning's first symptoms, as it damages the salivary glands. Finding copious drool, the foreman nods approvingly. He's ripening well. This macabre assessment reflects the widespread knowledge that mercury exposure progressed through predictable stages. Rather than removing affected workers, managers simply reassigned them to the lucky ones die quickly in cave-ins. The rest, ... Those with serious neurological damage assigned to simple sorting jobs until they became too incapacitated to work at all. He gestures toward a group of trembling workers, whose vacant expressions and drooling mouths reveal mercury's devastating neurological effects. The air grows thicker with toxic vapor as you descend. Your torch revealing workers as young as 8, hacking at the blood-red cinnabar or with primitive tools. Their skin has a ghostly pallor, broken only by the bright red lesions of mercury dermatitis. Mercury mining combined multiple deadly hazards into a single lethal occupation. You're witnessing the arrival of convicts sentenced to work the mines in the 16th and 17th centuries. These prisoners, guilty of offenses ranging from serious crimes to petty theft or simply unpaid debts, received what amounted to death sentences when assigned to mercury extraction. Spanish records document that at 2-year, you're examining the various ways these mines killed their workers, beginning with the extraction process itself. Miners chipped away at cinnabar, or in tight, poorly ventilated tunnels, creating dust that contained both mercury and silica particles. This toxic dust infiltrated lungs, causing simultaneous mercury poisoning and silicosis. One mainstream historical fact that highlights mercury mining as devastation was the Spanish Crown's use of forced labor sentence was effectively a life sentence. Few survived that long. The processing of mercury added another deadly dimension. You're observing workers at furnaces where cinnabar is heated to separate mercury from other minerals. Workers crawl into confined spaces coated with mercury residue, absorbing massive doses through every route of exposure. A particularly quirky tidbit about mercury mining involves the salivation test used by mine operators. Different tasks as their capabilities diminished. Workers with mild tremors might be moved from precision tasks to heavy labor. The global scope of mercury mining created similar conditions across continents. Neurological damage was so common, it became normalized. Despite operating in different cultures and continents, These mining operations shared remarkably similar patterns of human destruction. The social organization of mercury mining often exploited vulnerable populations. Mercury flowing into global markets, their suffering obscured by geographic isolation and social invisibility. Historians still argue whether mercury mining's extraordinary death toll was inevitable, given historical technology limitations, or could have been mitigated even with period knowledge. The mercury miners' legacy extends beyond their own suffering through environmental contamination. Mercury mining's historical significance extended far beyond the mines themselves, fueling global economic systems while remaining conveniently invisible to those who benefited. You're watching a young woman at her workstation in a New Jersey factory in 1922, carefully painting luminous numbers onto watch dials with a fine-tipped brush. Painted to death seems like an exaggeration until you observe her technique. After every few strokes, she shapes the brush tip with her lips, inadvertently ingesting minute amounts of radium with each point. The radium will steadily replace the calcium in their bones, causing them to fracture spontaneously, and in many cases, their jaw bones to literally disintegrate while they're still alive. You re-examining how World War I created demand for watches and instruments with dials that could be read in darkness, crucial for coordinating nighttime military operations. Radium's luminescent properties, when mixed with zinc sulfide, created a paint that glowed without requiring exposure to light first. Unlike previous phosphorescent compounds, you're re-reviewing internal company documents showing that executives and scientists at these firms took extensive precautions when handling radium themselves, using lead screens, tongs, and protective gear, while simultaneously telling dial painters the substance was safe enough to eat. When workers began developing mysterious health problems, company doctors and dentists misdiagnosed their conditions or attributed them to other causes, from syphilis to poor hygiene. This calculated deception continued even as the scientific you revisiting the home of a dial painter, who demonstrates how she can see her own hands in a darkened room, the accumulated radium in her bones, creating a faint but visible luminescence. Some workers reported that their hair glowed when brushed at night, while others noted their breath became luminous in cold weather. You're accompanying a young dial painter to her dentist appointment, watching in horror as an entire section of her jawbone comes away with a tooth, during what should have been a routine extraction. This condition, later termed radium jaw, saw bone tissue die and break down faster than it could heal, creating wounds that would not close and infections that could not be controlled. And sisters Quinta McDonald and Grace Fryer finally have their day in court after years of delays. Their attorney, Raymond Berry, has arranged for these women, now too ill to walk unassisted, to be present as living evidence of radium's effects. It's a case settled before reaching verdict. Establish crucial precedents for employer liability and workers' right to safety information. You're examining how the workforce composition, primarily young women, often. The dismissal of early health complaints as women's hysteria reflected gender biases in medicine and industry. Even the marketing of dial painting jobs is clean. You're reviewing how their cases directly influence the development of occupational safety standards for radiation work, labor, rights legislation, and workers' compensation, perhaps most significantly. Their story created a precedent for questioning industrial safety claims, empowering future workers to demand evidence rather than simply accepting employer assurances. When atomic and nuclear industries developed in later decades, The memory of the Radium Girls influenced safety protocols that likely saved countless lives. A legacy of protection purchased at the price of their suffering. Respectable work for young women. It's the ideal job for the girl who wants to make money and still have time to get married. Exploited gender expectations.
Oh.
While concealing deadly risks behind promises of respectability and good wages. More importantly, the publicity surrounding the case, with newspapers dubbing the women the Radium Girls, brought industrial radiation exposure into public consciousness, eventually leading to enhanced safety standards and better protection for future workers. Other victims experienced spontaneous fractures when their radium weakened. Bones broke under normal stress, sometimes while simply walking or rolling over in bed. Blood disorders, including anemia and leukemia, claimed others. Company records show awareness of potential hazards, with executives implementing safety measures for themselves while withholding them from workers, suggesting deliberate endangerment. However, the full effects of radiation were still being discovered during this period, and the specific mechanism of internal alpha radiation damage wasn't fully understood. What's clear is that when evidence of harm emerged, companies actively worked to suppress research, deny responsibility, and delay legal proceedings, in some cases explicitly hoping that victims would die before their cases reached court, reducing potential settlements. The women's suffering was prolonged and excruciating, their bodies deteriorating while medical professionals struggled to understand what was happening. This otherworldly glow, initially a source of amusement and even pride among the women, took on a macabre quality as they began connecting it to their mysterious ailments. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery, years later, that the remains of radium victims still glowed in their graves, their bones continuing to emit light long after death. A ghostly reminder of their this revolutionary product quickly expanded beyond military applications to consumer watches, clocks, and novelty items. The companies manufacturing these products, including the United States Radium Corporation, the Radium Dial Company, and others, employed primarily young women. As you're sitting in on a training session where new dial painters are explicitly instructed to use their lips to create the fine point needed for precise application. The technique was faster and produced better results than wiping the brush on a cloth, improving productivity and product quality. Some factories even prohibited alternative methods, reprimanding workers who attempted to avoid lip pointing as being inefficient. This employer-mandated technique delivered radium directly into the women's bodies, where the radioactive element's chemical similarity to calcium caused it to be incorporated into their bones. The ghostly green glow of radium-infused paint illuminates her face as she works, creating an eerily beautiful effect. The workers call themselves the Shining Girls, often applying the leftover paint to their teeth and nails before heading out for evening entertainment. These employers assured their workers that the paint was completely harmless, despite emerging scientific evidence suggesting otherwise. Delighting in how they glow in the dark at dance halls. They've been told the paint is perfectly safe, beneficial even. What these women don't know is that each time they point their brush with their lips, they're placing a deadly radioactive substance directly into their... The radium dial painting industry emerged in response to very practical needs. Dial painters, valuing their precision and dexterity for the delicate work. One mainstream historical fact that made this tragedy particularly devastating was the deliberate concealment of radium's dangers by company management. community's understanding of radiation dangers advanced, with companies actively suppressing medical investigations that might connect workers' symptoms to their employment. The lip-pointing technique that proved so deadly wasn't a worker shortcoming, but an employer-taught method, creating internal radiation sources that would continue damaging surrounding tissues for the remainder of their lives. A particularly quirky tidbit about the radium girls involves how their bodies literally glowed in the dark. Poisoning. The medical horrors experienced by the radium girls defy easy description. The legal battle that ensued became a landmark in occupational health history. Yuri sitting in the courtroom in 1928 as 5 dying dial painters from New Jersey, Catherine Schaub, Edna Husmann, Albina Laris. Historians still argue whether the radium company's actions represented calculated malice or motivated ignorance. You find evidence supporting both interpretations. The gender dynamics of the radium dial industry contributed significantly to the tragedy. Teenagers affected both working conditions and response to the emerging health crisis, while dominated company management viewed these workers as inherently replaceable. With new young women constantly available to fill positions, the lasting impact of the radium girls extended far beyond their personal tragedies. Laws. The scientific understanding gained from studying their illnesses, though at terrible human cost, established foundational knowledge about radiation, its biological effects. You're standing in an asbestos mine in Quebec circa 1940, watching as white dust fills the air so thickly it resembles a snowstorm. Asbestos. The miracle killer earned its contradictory nickname. Honestly, workers hack at the fibrous mineral with pickaxes, each impact releasing countless microscopic fibers that hang suspended around you. Everyone is covered in a ghostly white powder, their faces, hair, and clothing transformed into uniform pale versions of themselves. The men laugh and chat as they work, occasionally coughing but thinking nothing of it. They've been told the dust cleans the lungs. A preposterous claim. They've been nonetheless accepted from managers who themselves stay carefully distant from the thickest dust. You're touring a wartime shipyard where asbestos is being installed throughout ships, wrapped around pipes, packed into bulkheads. You're following the journey of a single asbestos fiber as it enters a worker's lungs. Too small to be filtered by the body's defenses, it embeds itself in lung tissue where it will remain permanently. You're examining a display of historical asbestos artifacts, including a napkin supposedly used by Charlemagne. According to legend, the emperor would impress guests by throwing this napkin into fire, then retrieving it unburned. You're visiting a textile factory where asbestos is being spun into thread and woven into fabric. The air is so thick with fibers that workers communicate by shouting, their voices muffled by the floating dust. You're re-reviewing internal documents from major asbestos companies, showing they were aware of asbestos' deadly effects decades before acknowledging them publicly. Particularly shocking is a 1930s study commissioned by asbestos manufacturers themselves, which documented clear evidence of asbestosis in workers. A study promptly suppressed. When the results proved concerning, company doctors examined workers and recorded their deteriorating health, but kept these records confidential. When independent researchers began publishing on asbestos diseases, industry lawyers worked to discredit their findings, funding counter-studies and creating manufactured doubt about established medical facts. You're comparing working conditions between asbestos operations in different countries, noting how regulations push the worst practices toward regions with less worker protection. As awareness of asbestos dangers grew in Western nations, operations shifted to developing countries where workers had fewer rights and less information. Even today, while most developed nations have banned asbestos, mining and manufacturing continue in countries like Russia, China, Kazakhstan, and Brazil, with products exported globally. This pattern, where hazardous industries migrate to wherever regulations are weakest, characterizes many deadly occupations throughout history, creating a race to the bottom for workers. This pattern of knowledge suppression continued well into the 1970s, decades after the deadly nature of women operating the carding machines that separate and align asbestos fibers before spinning are particularly exposed, standing in virtual clouds of pure asbestos. Their hair, eyebrows, and skin are completely whitened by dust that they will carry home on their bodies and clothes, exposing family members to secondary contamination. You find evidence pointing to a complex timeline of awareness. Early observations of dust disease among asbestos workers date back to the early 1900s, though the specific mechanism wasn't understood. By the 1930s, medical literature clearly documented asbestosis as an occupational disease. The link between asbestos and mesothelioma became irrefutable by the 1960s. What's clear is that industry awareness of dangers significantly preceded public acknowledgement or regulatory action. Internal corporate correspondence reveals debates about liability and profit margins rather than genuine scientific uncertainty, suggesting that economic considerations consistently. Most facilities lack even basic ventilation systems, operating under the industry-promoted belief that asbestos dust is merely a nuisance rather than a serious health hazard. Despite mounting medical evidence to the contrary, ancient Romans created funeral shrouds from asbestos to preserve the ashes of important individuals during cremation. These magical properties created an aura of wonder around asbestos that persisted into the modern era. Marketing materials from the early 20th century frequently reference this ancient history, presenting asbestos as a material with an illustrious pedigree rather than an industrial hazard. This mythology helped normalize a substance that, had it been newly discovered, might have prompted more over years and decades. This and thousands of other fibers caused progressive scarring, gradually reducing lung capacity and elasticity. The result is asbestosis, a condition where breathing becomes increasingly difficult as functional lung tissue is replaced by useless scar tissue. More deadly still is mesothelioma, a cancer of the pleural lining of the lungs almost exclusively caused by asbestos exposure. The crucial factor in these diseases is their extremely long latency period, typically 20 to 40 years between exposure and symptoms. This delay created perfect conditions for industry denial, as workers rarely connected their terminal, sprayed onto surfaces, creating environments where workers wade through asbestos dust so thick they can barely see each other. Military demand for fireproof materials created an asbestos boom, with mining and manufacturing expanding dramatically to meet wartime needs. After the war, these industrial capacities turned towards civilian applications, quote, with asbestos becoming ubiquitous in post-war construction. The asbestos industry successfully transformed from military supplier to consumer products manufacturer, bringing its deadly dust into homes, schools, offices across the developed world. What none of these workers realize is that each tiny fiber entering their lungs is effectively an immortal mineral splinter that will remain embedded in their lung tissue forever, gradually creating scarring that will, decades later, leave them gasping for breath like drowning men, or worse, develop into the signature cancer. So few materials have been simultaneously so useful and so deadly, specifically associated with this mineral that it bears its name, mesothelioma. The tragic irony of asbestos lies in the very properties that made it so valuable. You're examining a display of asbestos applications from the early 20th century. Fireproof theater curtains, insulation wrapping for pipes, brake linings, roofing materials, floor tiles, and even clothing. This naturally occurring mineral earned its reputation as a miracle material, honestly. Its resistance to fire, heat, electrical, and chemical damage, combined with its strength and flexibility, made it ideally suited for thousands of applications. Most valuable was its ability to save lives by preventing fires from spreading, protecting buildings and their occupants. The cruel paradox is that the same properties making asbestos nearly indestructible in industrial applications made it equally indestructible in human lungs, where its microscopic fibers, once lodged, could never be broken down or expelled. One mainstream historical fact that accelerated asbestos use was its role in World War II naval vessels and military equipment. The mechanics of asbestos-related disease create a particularly insidious pattern of delayed mortality. Illnesses to workplace exposures from decades earlier. A particularly quirky tidbit about asbestos involves its ancient reputation for magical properties. Caution regarding its unusual properties. The working conditions in asbestos processing facilities defied belief. The industry's deliberate suppression of medical knowledge represents one of history's most damning examples of corporate malfeasance. Asbestos had been conclusively established in medical literature. Historians still argue whether asbestos represents a case of initial ignorance followed by denial or knowing endangerment from the start. Outweighed health concerns once the dangers became apparent to industry leaders. The global nature of asbestos exploitation created an environmental justice dimension that continues today. Safety that transcends national boundaries. The scale of asbestos death toll exceeds many major wars, yet remains largely invisible. You're visiting a matchstick factory in Victorian London, your eyes watering from the acrid phosphorus fumes that hang heavily in the poorly ventilated workroom. Phossy-jaw horrors unfold before you as workers dip wooden splints into a heated mixture containing white phosphorus, creating the strike-honeyware matches that revolutionized firemaking. Workers called it the matchmaker's disease, but physicians recognized it as phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, a ghastly condition where the jawbone literally decays while the victim is still alive. Your attention is drawn to a young woman in the corner, her face grotesquely swollen on one side. As she turns, you struggle not to recoil. Part of her jawbone is actually visible through a hole in her cheek. The exposed bone glowing with a faint greenish luminescence in the dim light. You're reviewing employment records, showing that women and children comprised up to 90% of the workforce in many match factories. Match dipping was considered appropriate for female workers because it required dexterity rather than strength, allowing factory owners to pay lower wages, while portraying themselves as benevolent employers offering suitable work to vulnerable populations. Young women often sought these positions specifically because they seemed cleaner and less physically demanding than alternatives like textile mills. Many died from secondary infections or starvation when they could no longer eat. The foreman notices your stare and shrugs. Phossy jaw. They all get it eventually. She'll be gone in a month or two. couldn't work once the jaw starts coming apart. The casual tone with which he describes this horrific, you're examining the timeline of match production technology. Discovering that safer red phosphorus was available from the 1850s, decades before white phosphorus was finally banned. You re-witnessing the famous 1888 match girls' strike at Bryant and May's London factory, where Annie Besant helped 1,400 women and girls organize against inhumane conditions. Their collective action brought international attention to phossy jaw and other hazards, creating public pressure that eventually contributed to regulatory changes. You're comparing how different countries address this industrial disease. Noting that Finland banned white phosphorus matches as early as 1872, with Denmark following in 1874. In contrast, Britain waited until 1908, and the United States until 1912. You're reviewing how matchworkers' suffering catalyzed broader conversations about industrial responsibility and government oversight of workplace conditions. The vivid horror of phosphorus necrosis, with its visible disfigurement and distinctive glowing bones, created public sympathy in ways that less visible industrial diseases often failed to achieve. Photographs and descriptions of phossy jaw victims appeared in newspapers and reform publications, making abstract discussions of occupational health viscerally real to middle-class readers. This public pressure contributed to the development of industrial hygiene as a field and established precedents for government intervention to protect workers, foundations upon which modern workplace safety. This patchwork regulation created regulatory arbitrage, with production shifting to countries with weaker protections. The ultimate solution came through the 1906 Berne Convention, international treaty prohibiting white phosphorus in matches. One of the first examples of international cooperation to address an occupational health hazard. This pattern, where the most dangerous industries migrate to jurisdictions with the weakest regulations, would repeat throughout industrial history, creating a race to the bottom for worker protections that often required international coordination too. What makes this movement remarkable is that it was led by young working-class women with few resources and little formal education, precisely the demographic considered least likely to successfully challenge industrial power. Their victory demonstrated that even the most vulnerable workers could effect change through solidarity, creating an important precedent for occupational health activism. Factory owners resisted switching because white phosphorus matches were cheaper to produce and more popular with consumers who valued the convenience of strike honeyware functionality. When companies did produce safer matches, they marketed them as premium products at higher prices. The technology to prevent phossy jaw existed long before regulations required its implementation. But economic calculations consistently valued pennies saved over your following a typical case through medical records. It begins with persistent toothaches and painful swelling. It's often misdiagnosed as routine dental problems. As the condition advances, abscesses form, releasing pus with a distinctive garlic odor. You're re-listening to factory veterans explain this term to new employees. Workers in the dipping rooms developed a distinctive smell from phosphorus exposure, a garlicky odor that emanated from their breath, sweat, and even hair. You find evidence supporting a complex evolution of knowledge. The first medical descriptions of phosphorus necrosis appeared in the 1840s, just a decade after white phosphorus matches entered mass production. By the 1860s, the connection was well established in medical literature. Industry publications show awareness of the risk, yet factory owners implemented few protective measures beyond telling workers to maintain good dental hygiene. advice that placed responsibility on victims rather than addressing the actual exposure. The decades-long gap between scientific recognition of the hazard and meaningful regulation suggests that economic considerations consistently outweighed health concerns once the dangers became apparent. This smell was so strong that matchworkers were sometimes asked to sit separately in churches or public transportation. They became known as mice because their hair would sometimes glow faintly in the dark from phosphorus dust, creating an eerie resemblance to the bioluminescent eyes of rodents in dimly lit rooms. This phosphorescent quality extended beyond their working hours. Following them home, the gums recede from the decaying bone, which takes on a blackened, mottled appearance. Most disturbing is the bone's luminescence. The phosphorus-infused jawbone actually glows in the dark, creating the macabre spectacle of victims whose mouths emit a faint light when they open them in darkness. The final stages involve pieces of jawbone breaking off or requiring deterioration. Speaks volumes about how normalized such suffering had become. The match industry created this nightmare through its adoption of white phosphorus, a highly unstable form of the element. You re-examining the chemical properties that made white phosphorus simultaneously useful and deadly. It ignites at low temperatures when exposed to air. The result was catastrophic deterioration that typically began with toothaches and swelling, progressed to abscesses and exposed bone, and often ended with massive infection as the necrotic jawbone created ideal conditions for bacteria, creating reliable strike-anywhere matches. But this same reactivity makes it incredibly toxic to living tissue. Workers absorb the phosphorus through inhalation of vapors, skin contact, and ingestion when they ate with contaminated hands. Once in the body, the phosphorus had a particular affinity for the jawbone, where it gradually replaced calcium in the bone structure. One mainstream historical fact that made matchmaking particularly devastating was its status as female-dominated light work, or domestic service. This gendered division of labor concentrated phosphorus exposure among women, creating a situation where a specific demographic bore the brunt of the industry's human cost. The progression of phossy jaw created suffering that's difficult to comprehend. Surgical removal, leaving victims permanently disfigured if they survived at all. A particularly quirky tidbit about phosphorus match production involves the workers' nickname of mice, marking them as match workers even in their private lives, a constant reminder of their toxic occupation. The industry's resistance to safer alternatives revealed profit's priority over human life. Workers' lives until public opinion and labor activism finally forced change. The matchworkers' strikes represent a crucial chapter in industrial labor history. Historians still argue whether phossy jaw represents a case of initial scientific ignorance or deliberate industry negligence. The international response to phossy jaw reveals important patterns in occupational health regulation. Resolve. The legacy of phossy jaw extends beyond those directly affected through its SEE. Its influence on occupational health standards. Regulations would eventually be built. You're standing in a Roman-led smelting facility, circa 100 CE, watching slaves stir molten metal in open furnaces, completely engulfed in bluish toxic fumes. Lead's invisible victims extend in an unbroken chain from antiquity to the modern era, creating perhaps history's longest-running occupational health disaster. Most disturbing is watching pregnant women walk through these fumes on their way to nearby homes, unknowingly exposing their unborn children to a poison that will permanently damage developing brains. The roaming overseer proudly explains how this versatile metal makes their civilization possible. it in their water pipes. Cooking vessels, wine containers, cosmetics. Lead workers throughout history absorbed this toxin through inhalation, ingestion, and skin contact, suffering effects that ranged from subtle neurological damage to acute fatal poisoning. You're visiting a typesetting shop in the 1800s, watching as workers handle lead type with bare hands, breathing fumes from melting pots that constantly replenish worn letters. From Gutenberg's first press until the late 20th century, virtually every book, newspaper, and printed material involved workers handling lead-based type. Printers and typesetters suffered disproportionately from what became known as printer's palsy, tremors, paralysis, and neurological. You're examining this troublesome element's characteristics. Easily melted at relatively low temperatures, remarkably malleable, yet durable, resistant to corrosion, and abundant in nature. This pattern, where progress comes at the hidden cost of worker health, repeats throughout lead's industrial history. This connection became so established that in some regions, lead workers were known as particularly heavy drinkers. Their alcoholism seen as an occupational characteristic rather than a response to chronic poisoning. You're visiting a pottery where workers apply lead glazes to ceramics, dipping their bare arms into solutions containing up to 50% lead compounds. The finished pieces gleam with the distinctive shine that only lead can provide. But the artisans themselves show the classic signs of poisoning: the dark lead line visible on their gums, constant digestive complaints, and progressive neurological symptoms. Most potters consider these health problems simply part. Male lead workers experienced reduced fertility and higher rates of abnormal sperm, while women faced menstrual disorders and pregnancy complications. You find evidence supporting both perspectives, but with a clear evolution over time. Ancient civilizations likely used lead without understanding its toxicity, though some ancient writers did note harmful effects. Re-examining documents from the Lead Industries Association, revealing coordinated efforts to undermine research linking lead to health problems. This playbook, denying established science, manufacturing uncertainty, and delaying regulation, would be replicated by numerous other hazardous industries, creating a template for prioritizing profit over public health. When studies demonstrated lead's neurological effects, industry-funded counter-research created manufactured controversy, exploiting scientific uncertainty to delay protective measures. This pattern, where hazardous industries migrate to wherever regulations are weakest, characterizes many deadly occupations throughout history, creating a race to the bottom for workers' safety that transcends national boundaries. Most notorious was the industry's decades-long defense of leaded gasoline. Despite clear evidence of harm to workers and the public, the industry. By the 17th century, medical literature clearly documented lead's dangers, yet industrial practices changed little. These reproductive effects created a shadow population of victims who never set foot in industrial facilities, yet suffered lifelong consequences from their parents' occupational exposures. This pattern suggests an evolution from genuine ignorance to willful negligence, with economic considerations increasingly outweighing health concerns as scientific evidence mounted. You're reviewing medical texts from different periods, noting how symptoms were recognized long before their cause was understood. Hippocrates described what was likely lead colic in 370 BCE, but without identifying lead as the culprit. You're comparing working conditions between lead operations in different countries, noting how regulation in developed nations pushed the most dangerous practices toward regions with weaker protections. As awareness of lead dangers grew in Western countries, operations shifted to developing nations where workers had fewer rights and less information. Even today, battery recycling, which involves breaking or reviewing birth records from communities near lead industries, noting patterns of miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant mortality far exceeding normal rates, lead readily crosses the placental barrier, directly poisoning developing fetuses whose neurological systems are particularly vulnerable. Children born to lead workers often showed developmental delays, learning disabilities. The technique of mouth-blowing excess glaze, where workers literally blew through straws to create decorative patterns, directly introduced lead into their bodies. Despite clear evidence of harm, lead glazes remain standard in many ceramics operations into the 20th century, prized for their beautiful finish and low firing temperature, despite their deadly effects on workers. Roman engineer Vitruvius noted that water from lead pipes seemed unhealthy, recommending clay pipes instead, advice largely ignored. By the Middle Ages, some metal workers recognized lead sickness as an occupational hazard. Yet comprehensive understanding remained. These qualities made lead extraordinarily useful across dozens of industries. From plumbing to printing, ceramics to armaments, its sweet taste, which led to its use as a wine preservative and food additive, masked its profound toxicity. This combination of utility, this gap between medical knowledge and preventive action, reflects a recurring pattern in industrial health history, where evidence of harm often precedes effective intervention by generations and even used as a food sweetener. What neither he nor the coughing workers realize is that they being systematically poisoned by one of history's most insidious neurotoxins. You interviewing lead workers across different industries who explain the widespread belief that alcohol protects against lead poisoning is folk remedy. Drinking milk or alcohol to coat the stomach against lead appeared across cultures and time periods. While milk actually can reduce lead absorption somewhat, alcohol does nothing protective. However, the temporary relief from lead-induced stomach pain that the trembling hands of older workers, their pallid complexions, and frequent complaints of stomach pain are all signs of chronic lead poisoning, a condition so common in lead-working regions that no one connects these symptoms to the metal itself. Lead's deadly occupational legacy stems from its contradictory properties, and poison created the perfect conditions for widespread industrial use, despite mounting evidence of harm. One mainstream historical fact that highlights lead's industrial impact was its central role in printing technology. Deterioration resulting from chronic lead exposure. The bitter irony is that the technology that democratized knowledge and advanced human civilization simultaneously poisoned generations of workers who made it possible. The medical understanding of lead poisoning evolved with agonizing slowness, elusive. Even after physician Bernardino Romazzini formally documented occupational lead poisoning in 1713, industry resistance and economic interests delayed meaningful protective measures for centuries. A particularly quirky tidbit about lead working involves the profession's overlap with alcoholism. Alcohol created a false impression of efficacy, leading many workers to become alcoholics in a misguided attempt at self-medication. The ceramics industry created particularly concentrated lead exposure of their trade rather than preventable hazards. The reproductive impacts of lead exposure created intergenerational tragedy, behavioral problems, consequences rarely connected to parental occupational exposure. Historians still argue whether lead's industrial persistence represents a case of ignorance about its dangers or deliberate prioritization of profit over health. 20th century presents the most troubling case, as internal industry documents reveal explicit knowledge of lead hazards coupled with public denial and active opposition to regulation. The lead industry's deliberate manipulation of science created deadly delays in regulation, funded sympathetic researchers, attacked independent scientists, and leveraged political influence to maintain profits despite mounting evidence of lead's dangers. The global dimensions of lead work created environmental justice concerns that persist today. Open lead-acid batteries and melting their components continues in unregulated facilities across Africa and Asia, creating exposure levels reminiscent of 19th century conditions. You're standing on the floor of a massive textile mill in Manchester, England in 1830, surrounded by deafening machinery and choking cotton dust. Factory children's plight unfolds before you as 8-year-olds dart between thundering looms, their small fingers repairing broken threads and collecting cotton waste. Her bare feet navigate the grease-slicked floor as she emerges safely this time, though the missing fingers on her left hand tell you she hasn't always been so fortunate. The children work 14-hour shifts in this cacophonous hell, their growth visibly stunted from malnutrition and the crushing physical demands of factory labor. Most disturbing is their aged appearance. These are not children in any meaningful sense, but miniature adults whose childhood has been sacrificed to industrial progress. Their small bodies valued only for their ability to reach into dangerous machinery spaces where adults cannot fit. In reality, they became something close to slaves, working from dawn until night, sleeping in crowded dormitories, receiving minimal food, and enduring brutal discipline.
Ow.
Their legal guardians were the very parish officials who had consigned them to this fate, creating a system with virtually no oversight or protection. Contemporary accounts describe children as young as 5 being transported hundreds of miles from their birthplaces to work in isolated factories where they had no advocates or escape options. One girl with hollow eyes and stunted growth scurries beneath a still-moving machine to retrieve a fallen these children, often as young as 6. Began work hours before dawn, moving through dark streets regardless of whether to ensure other workers arrived on time. You're examining growth records comparing factory children with those from non-industrial factory owners, found that children could be paid pennies for this role, which required them to memorize dozens of addresses. Physicians' reports documented vision damage from working in poorly lit conditions, hearing loss from constant machinery noise, and respiratory diseases from industrial dust and fumes. Most devastating were the cognitive and emotional impacts. Children working 7-0-8-hour weeks had no opportunity for education, play, or normal social development. This economic argument that protecting children would undermine national prosperity proved remarkably effective at delaying meaningful reforms for decades, but typically involved more varied tasks, family supervision, and natural limitations from daylight and seasons. You're comparing daily schedules between factory children and their middle-class counterparts, noting how industrial capitalism simultaneously created the as-middle-class Victorian. Culture increasingly idealized childhood as a special period requiring protection and nurturing. Working-class children faced longer hours and more dangerous conditions than ever before. You're attending meetings of various anti-child labor advocates, noting the diversity of their concerns. Religious reformers focused on moral degradation and lack of spiritual education. While medical professionals emphasize developmental damage, military officials express concern about the poor physical condition of recruits raised in factories. This coalition of interests, not all primarily concerned with children's welfare, eventually generated enough political pressure to overcome industrial resistance, creating the gradual reforms that would eventually remove children from the most dangerous industrial settings. Though only after millions had already been sacrificed to industrial progress. Some were genuinely humanitarian, horrified by children's suffering. Others worried primarily about this bifurcation created two entirely different conceptions of childhood, existing simultaneously. One where children were precious beings requiring education and care, and another where they were simply small workers whose value lay in their economic utility and replaceability. Factory work introduced unprecedented regimentation, duration, and machinery dangers, creating qualitatively different risks. The historical record suggests that while child work was nothing new, industrialization fundamentally transformed its nature and intensity, creating systemic exploitation that was indeed worse than what came before, particularly for the most vulnerable children without family protection. When regulations did begin, they were filled with loopholes and weakly enforced. The half-time system, for instance, supposedly limited children to half days of work to allow for schooling, but in practice often meant children worked mornings in one factory and afternoons in another. This pattern, where economic considerations consistently outweighed humanitarian concerns, characterized child labor regulation throughout the industrial era. Medical observers noted that factory children often displayed what would now be recognized as symptoms of trauma and developmental disorders. Flat affect, difficulty with language acquisition, and behavioral issues alternating between extreme passivity and sudden aggression. And precise wake-up times without being able to read clocks or street signs. You're reviewing parliamentary testimony from factory owners arguing against. This job, literally serving as human timepieces, reflected how industrial capitalism commodified every aspect of children's capabilities, including their ability to wake early and function in pre-dawn darkness. You re-reviewing hospital and coroner records documenting the ways young workers died or were maimed, caught and unguarded. You're comparing pre-industrial child work, typically occurring within family agricultural. You're observing the morning shift change at a textile mill, watching as designated children called knockers up move through worker housing. Textile mills produce distinctive injuries. Mule spinners' cancer affected boys who worked straddling machines, while girls lost fingers and hands to unguarded equipment. Mining children suffered spinal deformities from crawling through tunnels, pulling coal carts. These injuries occurred at rates that would be unimaginable today, with medical records from industrial towns showing upwards of 50% of child workers experiencing significant injury before adulthood. Bobbin, a moment's hesitation means a beating from the overseer. Industrial capitalism's need for cheap, compliant workers made children ideal targets. Their smaller size, actually preferred for certain tasks like cleaning machinery or working in confined mining spaces. Factory owners openly stated that children were easier to discipline, complained less, and could be paid a fraction of adult wages, creating economic incentives that transformed children into disposable industrial inputs rather than developing humans with special vulnerabilities and needs. The Industrial Revolution created unprecedented demand for child workers, transforming traditional patterns of child labor into something far more exploitative. You're witnessing the arrival of a wagon at a textile mill, unloading dozens of pale, malnourished children from urban workhouses. These parish apprentices settings with varied tasks and natural breaks, with the regimented horror of factory labor, one mainstream historical fact that facilitated widespread child industrial exploitation was the parish apprentice system. Orphans, or children of destitute families, were essentially sold by poor law authorities to factory owners under the guise of providing them with marketable skills. The physical dangers children faced in industrial settings were horrifically diverse. Machinery that tore off limbs or scalped them when their hair became entangled, crushed under falling equipment or materials, suffocated in coal mine collapses or overcome by toxic fumes. A particularly quirky tidbit about child factory workers involves their specialized roles as human alarm clocks. Using long poles with wire attachments to tap on upper-story windows, waking adult workers for their shifts. The developmental consequences of industrial child labor extended far beyond immediate physical dangers. Backgrounds, finding that factory children were on average several inches shorter and significantly underweight. The economic structures underlying child labor created powerful resistance to reform. Restrictions on child employment, claiming such regulations would make British goods uncompetitive with foreign manufacturers. Historians still argue whether child industrial labor represented a worsening of conditions, compared to pre-industrial child work, or simply made existing exploitation more visible. You find evidence supporting complex conclusions. Agricultural child labor could certainly be brutal. The class dimensions of child labor created stark disparities in childhood experiences. Modern concept of protected childhood for the privileged, while intensifying exploitation of working-class children. The reform movements that eventually restricted child labor emerged from complex motivations: competition with adult workers, or the creation of an uneducated populace. You're watching a stonecutter in ancient Egypt apply final details to a temple column. His rhythmic chisel strikes, releasing fine clouds of dust that dance in the sunlight, before settling in his lungs. Silicosis. Stonecutter's doom represents humanity's oldest occupational disease, killing workers across 6 continents and throughout recorded history. The Egyptian craftsman coughs violently, a deep racking spasm that brings up blood-tinged sputum. You're traveling through time and across continents, observing silica's victims in ancient quarries, medieval stoneworks, industrial-era mines, modern sandblasting operations, and countless construction sites. The disease's mechanism remained consistent regardless of context. When workers inhaled dust containing crystalline silica, the sharp-edged particles became embedded in lung tissue. You're descending into a 19th century hard rock mine, observing how virtually every aspect of underground mining generated silica dust. Drilling into quartz-bearing rock created the highest exposures, with miners working in confined spaces filled with dust so thick it was often impossible to see more than a few feet. Before wet drilling methods were introduced, miners typically worked in a constant cloud of silica particles. The introduction of pneumatic drills in the late 19th century actually worsened the situation. These widowmakers generated finer dust that penetrated deeper into lungs while drilling faster, significantly increasing both exposure intensity and production quotas. You're re-reviewing medical records from the early 20th century? Physicians noticed that silicosis victims had dramatically higher rates of tuberculosis, creating what they called silicotuberculous. Research eventually revealed that silica particles not only damaged lung tissue, but also impaired the very immune cells responsible for fighting tuberculosis bacteria. This deadly synergy meant that in many mining communities, workers faced a double threat. Their occupational exposure to silica not only caused direct lung damage, but also made this economic calculation, where worker health was treated as a replaceable resource rather than a value to be protected, characterized silica industries throughout history. Contemporary medical reports documented this interaction created diagnostic confusion, with many silicosis deaths misattributed to tuberculosis alone, artificially lowering official statistics on occupational disease. You find evidence supporting a complex evolution of understanding. Ancient Romans noted the dangerous bad air in certain mines, with Pliny the Elder observing that miners used protective respiratory coverings. By the 16th century, Paracelsus and Agricola documented specific respiratory diseases among miners and stonecutters, where workers paid with their lives for technological transitions that eventually became safer for their successors. You're comparing stoneworkers' conditions across ancient Egypt, medieval European cathedral construction, Japanese stone lantern carving, and modern Indian sandstone quarries, finding remarkably consistent hazards despite separated by thousands of years and miles. The universality of silica's effects on human lungs transcended cultural and technological differences, creating parallel epidemics wherever humans worked with stone. Even today, silicosis remains a major occupational health crisis. In developing the definitive connection between silica, dust, and lung disease was established by the early 20th century. This ongoing tragedy demonstrates how occupational hazards often migrate globally as regulation improves in some regions while exploitation continues elsewhere. This timeline suggests that while the specific mechanism might not have triggering inflammatory responses that gradually replaced functional lung tissue with useless scar tissue, you're examining payment systems across different industries, finding that piece rate compensation, where workers were paid by output rather than time, dominated many silica-generating occupations. You're comparing traditional hand drilling methods with the introduction of pneumatic tools in the late 19th century, which dramatically increased dust generation and worker exposure. This pattern, where technological advances often initially increased occupational hazards, before later innovations addressed them, repeats across industrial history. The eventual development of wet drilling, ventilation systems, and dust collection equipment significantly reduced silica exposures, but this created financial pressure to maximize production at the expense of safety measures that might slow work. Like sandblasters, for instance, could significantly increase their daily earnings by removing protective equipment that restricted vision or mobility, directly trading their long-term health for immediate income. Similarly, unlike many industrial toxins that might be eliminated from the body over time, silica particles remained permanently in the lungs, and shortness of breath during exertion, symptoms easily dismissed as normal in physically demanding occupations. You're interviewing workers who spent years or decades in high-exposure environments before developing noticeable symptoms, creating a disconnection between cause and effect that complicated both medical understanding and regulatory responses. By the time workers became symptomatic, many had already left the industries that poisoned them, making occupational connections less obvious. This delay also created challenges for workers' compensation, as employers could argue that symptoms developing years after employment ended might have other. As the disease advances, breathing becomes increasingly difficult even at rest. Victims describing the sensation as breathing through a pillow. Lungs lose elasticity as functional tissue is replaced by scar tissue, requiring greater effort for diminishing respiratory function. In later stages, the heart becomes strained from pumping blood through damaged lungs, leading to heart failure. Secondary infections become common as damaged lungs cannot clear bacteria effectively. The final stage creating is fellow workers barely react. This stonecutter's consumption, so common among them that they view it as an inevitable occupational fate, rather than a preventable disease. The master craftsman beside you points out advanced carvers with decades of experience, noting with resigned pride that only the most skilled survive past 40. What neither he nor his workers understand is that each breath they take fills their lungs with microscopic stone particles that act like countless tiny razors, gradually slicing lung tissue into useless scar tissue. The beautiful temples and monuments they create will stand for millennia, while their creators' bodies are being destroyed from within by the very material they transform into art. Silicosis devastated workers across extraordinarily diverse industries united by a single factor: the creation of respirable silica dust. Progressive and irreversible damage that continued even after exposure ended. One mainstream historical fact that made silicosis particularly widespread was its central role in mining operations worldwide. Entire mining communities devastated by miners' consumption, with some regions showing more than 80% of long-term miners developing the disease. The progression of silicosis followed a cruelly predictable pattern, following a typical case through medical records. It begins with a persistent cough, often involves respiratory failure, with victims essentially drowning as their scarred lungs can no longer transfer oxygen to the bloodstream. A slow suffocation that could take years of increasingly desperate gasping for breath. A particularly quirky tidbit about silicosis involves its strange relationship with tuberculosis. Them uniquely vulnerable to tuberculosis, which was often widespread in crowded, poorly ventilated worker housing. The economic structures of stoneworking and mining created powerful incentives to ignore silicosis. Owners found it cheaper to replace workers who became incapacitated than to implement dust control measures. The delayed onset of symptoms made silicosis particularly difficult to address. Causes. Most perniciously, the progressive nature of silicosis meant that damage continued advancing even after exposure ended, creating a deferred death sentence that remained invisible until too late for intervention. Historians still argue whether silicosis represents a case of long-standing knowledge ignored for economic reasons or genuine. Scientific uncertainty about dust hazards. Been understood until modern times, the general hazard was recognized across millennia, yet effective protective measures remained rare until the mid-20th century, suggesting that economic considerations consistently outweighed health concerns once the dangers became apparent. The technological changes that both worsened and eventually reduced silicosis risk reveal important patterns in industrial health. Came decades after the technology that intensified the hazard. This lag between hazard creating and hazard controlling innovations created generational sacrifices. The global nature of silicosis created similar patterns of suffering across vastly different cultures and time periods. Nations, with millions of workers in mining, construction, and stone processing industries, exposed to levels similar to those seen in 19th century Europe and America. You're touring a massive cotton mill in Lancashire, England circa 1850, where the air is so thick with floating cotton fibers that workers appear as ghostly silhouettes in the haze. Textile terror tales surround you in this cathedral of industry, where the relentless clatter of hundreds of mechanical looms creates a noise so deafening that workers have developed an elaborate sign language to communicate. You notice an older woman mouthing words with exaggerated lip movements. She's been completely deafened by decades on the factory floor. Nearby, a middle-aged man bends double in a coughing fit, bringing up the black-flecked phlegm characteristic of cotton lung. Most disturbing are the missing fingers and mangled limbs visible among many workers. Grim testaments to moments of inattention around unguarded machinery that shows no forgiveness for human error. You're reviewing accident logs from cotton mills showing that amputations, crushing injuries, and fatal. Workers' clothing, particularly women, slong dresses, and loose sleeves, could catch in machinery and drag them into the equipment before they could react. Children employed to clear waste cotton from under still-running machines suffered particularly high injury rates. Their small bodies sometimes pulled entirely into the machinery. These traumatic injuries created a visible population of textile veterans with missing fingers, hands, and limbs. Living testimonials to the industry's dangers walking the streets of every textile town. You're examining how textile production transformed from a cottage industry into the first true factory system, creating unprecedented concentrations of machinery, workers, and hazardous conditions. An uneven hip development that affected workers who repeatedly leaned to one side while operating spinning machines for 12 to 14 hours daily from childhood. Similarly, Weaver's bottom described the flattened, calloused posterior developed from sitting on hard wooden seats for decades. These occupational deformities became so normalized in textile communities that they served as identifiers of specific jobs. Medical examiners could often determine precisely what textile operation a worker performed simply by observing their distinctive physical distortions. These visible markers of occupation reflected how thoroughly industrial work reshaped human bodies to match machine requirements rather than adapting machinery to human physiology. You find evidence supporting both interpretations. Factory owners clearly prioritized production over safety, often removing guards that slowed operations and opposing regulations that would have reduced hazards. Conversely, the medical understanding of occupational disease remained limited, with conditions like byssinosis not fully documented until the late 19th century. You recomparing conditions between regulated British mills in the early 20th century and contemporaneous operations in colonial India and China, finding that as safety standards improved in Europe, the most dangerous practices shifted to regions with no worker protections. You're reviewing medical records showing how women, who comprise the majority of textile workers in many regions, suffered unique health impacts. The combination of workplace hazards with period-specific gender expectations proved particularly devastating. Women were expected to maintain households and care for children despite debilitating occupational illnesses and injuries. Pregnant women working around machinery experienced high rates of miscarriage from physical strain and accidents. While chemical exposures created birth defects in children born to textile workers, perhaps most pernicious was the medical establishment's tendency to attribute women's occupational symptoms to female hysteria, or inherent weakness rather than workplace conditions, creating both this pattern continued through the 20th century. With textile hazards migrating from the United States to Latin America, then to Southeast Asia and Africa, as regulation followed a similar geographical progression. Even today, textile workers in less regulated regions face conditions reminiscent of 19th century factories. Unguarded machinery, minimal ventilation, and toxic chemical exposures, creating a continuous chain of suffering that is merely... The truth appears to combine both factors. Initial ignorance about specific health mechanisms, followed by resistance to safety measures once hazards became apparent. Economic calculations consistently outweighed health concerns, with machinery guarding and dust control implemented only. You're consulting with a physician specializing in textile workers. You're visiting a dye works where workers stand over steaming vats of vibrant colors, their skin and hair permanently stained by the chemicals they handle without protection. Many dyes contained arsenic, mercury, and lead compounds that workers absorb through skin contact and vapor inhalation. You're interviewing mill workers about the effects of constant noise, finding that many experience persistent loom dreams, nightmares filled with the inescapable clatter of machinery that prevented restful sleep. The relentless pace of mechanized production created unprecedented stress, as workers had to maintain human attention and precision while matching the tireless rhythm of machines. Most textile operations involved constant vigilance for thread breaks or machinery malfunctions, creating a state of perpetual alertness that workers couldn't easily disengage from even after leaving the factory. Medical records from textile towns documented higher rates of nervous exhaustion, anxiety disorders, and what would now be recognized as industrial PTSD. Psychological consequences of particularly notorious was aniline dye, which caused bladder cancer at rates so high that it became known as dye workers' cancer before the carcinogenic mechanism was understood. The beautiful colored fabrics that adorned Victorian homes and wardrobes carried a hidden cost in the poisoned bodies of dye workers, whose life expectancies rarely extended past their 30s. The cruel irony was that these workers often wore the cheapest undyed clothing themselves, unable to afford the colorful products whose creation was killing. Workers faced a perfect storm of hazards, mechanical dangers from unguarded moving parts, respiratory diseases from fiber dust, hearing loss from constant machinery noise, physical deformities from unnatural repetitive motions, and chemical exposures from dyes and processing agents. Cotton dust caused bisonosis or brown lung. Flax processing led to flax dressers disease, and wool sorting created risk of anthrax from contaminated imports. Most insidious was the industry practice of cotton stripping, having workers clean machinery while it continued running, creating dense dust clouds that workers breathed directly. The symptoms followed predictable patterns. Initial Monday fever when returning to work after a day away, gradually progressing to permanent shortness of breath and eventual respiratory failure. Unlike traumatic injuries, these conditions developed gradually, allowing factory owners to attribute them to workers' weak constitutions rather than occupational exposure. This combination made textile work a gauntlet of occupational hazards that workers navigated daily, with each shift representing a potential encounter with life-altering injury or progressive disease. As the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution, textile, the foreman casually mentions they keep a surgeon on retainer specifically for amputations, adding with dark humor that they measure a good production day by the absence of severed limbs rather than their presence. The textile industry's deadly impact stemmed from its pioneering role in industrialization. Factories developed with virtually no safety regulations or occupational health understanding, establishing dangerous practices that would become normalized across other industries. One mainstream historical fact that highlights textile dangers was the extraordinarily high rate of traumatic injuries from machinery. Entanglements occurred with horrifying regularity. The power looms, carding engines, and spinning machines operated without safety guards, their moving parts fully exposed as they ran at increasingly high speeds. The respiratory diseases caused by textile dust created less visible but equally devastating effects. Lung, examining how different fibers created distinct respiratory conditions. A particularly quirky tidbit about textile work involves the industry-specific physical deformities that became so common they received their own names. You re-observing what contemporaries called spinner's bottom, the distinctive twisted spine, the chemical hazards of textile processing created particularly horrific conditions in dyeing operations. The psychological toll of textile work created distinct patterns of mental health impacts. Environments that demanded machine-like performance from human minds and bodies. Historians still argue whether the harsh conditions in early textile factories represented deliberate exploitation or simply reflected limited understanding of occupational health. When regulations finally forced change decades after hazards were recognized, the global spread of textile manufacturing created a pattern where hazards migrated to regions with the least protection, or relocated rather than diminished over time. The gendered nature of textile work created specific patterns of female occupational disease. Misdiagnosis and victim blaming that delayed recognition of genuine occupational diseases. You're standing at the edge of a vast rubber plantation in the Belgian Congo circa 1905, witnessing a scene of systematic brutality that exemplifies colonial labor tragedies at their most extreme. African workers move through the trees, making precise cuts in the bark to harvest latex, their bodies bearing the scars of previous punishments for failing to meet impossible quotas. Most disturbing is the overseer's matter-of-fact attitude. These atrocities are aberrations but standard business practices designed to maximize production while minimizing costs in an economic system, where native lives hold no value beyond their labor potential. You're re-examining how European powers established labor systems in their colonies that would have been unthinkable in their home countries, creating mortality rates that sometimes exceeded 50% annually in the most exploitative operations. This disconnection between consumption and production created a system where colonial workers essentially became sacrificial inputs in global supply chains, their suffering and deaths conveniently invisible to those who benefited from their labor. You reviewing official records documenting how this rubber terror regime caused the deaths of approximately 10 million Congolese between 1885 and 1908, roughly half the region's population. When international pressure finally forced reforms, the Belgian government's own commission confirmed death rates. That would rank among history.
Yes.
Worst genocides. All in service of meeting European demand for rubber bicycle tires and industrial components. Workers were assigned impossible collection quotas, with failure punished by mutilation, hostage-taking of family members, or execution. Field laborers suffered in the tropical heat, where dehydration, heat stroke, and exhaustion claimed many lives. You're investigating how this anti-malarial medication, derived from cinchona bark, simultaneously saved European lives while enabling deeper exploitation of indigenous once quinine became widely available to colonial administrators and company managers. They could survive in previously uninhabitable regions, but this medication was rarely provided to indigenous workers. Safety measures considered standard in European mines, proper shoring, ventilation, emergency equipment, are entirely absent. Workers descend on crude rope ladders, work in unstable tunnels, and handle explosives with minimal training. You're visiting a nutmeg plantation in the Dutch East Indies, where workers harvest from trees containing volatile oils that cause severe dermatitis and respiratory problems with prolonged exposure. The processing of cinnamon, cloves, K, and peppers created similar health hazards through contact with irritant compounds and dust inhalation. You find evidence supporting complex conclusions. The physical distance between European consumers and colonial producers certainly facilitated exploitation beyond what would have been tolerated domestically. However, many of the same profit-maximizing principles that drove colonial atrocities also appeared in European and American industrial settings, albeit usually in less extreme forms. The truth appears to combine both perspectives. Colonial labor systems represented not a different kind of exploitation, but rather exploitation freed from the moderating influences of domestic public opinion, labor organization, and cultural proximity, revealing capitalism's raw potential for human destruction when unconstrained. You're comparing historical colonial operations with contemporary manufacturing and resource extraction in developing nations, finding disturbing parallels in how geographical and cultural distance still facilitates exploitation. While the explicit brutality of colonial regimes has largely disappeared, economic coercion has replaced physical force in many instances, with workers accepting dangerous conditions out of desperation rather than under direct threat. It's a fundamental dynamic, where consumers in wealthy nations remain disconnected from the human costs of production in poorer regions. Continues to most exploitative was the Dutch culture stella. This persistent pattern suggests that colonial labor tragedies represent not merely historical atrocities, but early manifestations of structural problems that continue shaping global production systems today, that forced indigenous farmers to devote a percentage of their land to export crops rather than food production. You're examining how tropical diseases, extreme heat, dangerous wildlife, and unfamiliar terrain created additional hazards beyond the work itself. Workers in rubber collection areas navigated snake-infested forests. Mining operations exposed laborers to tropical diseases their immune systems had never encountered. And plantation work required constant sun exposure that led to high rates of heat stroke and dehydration. Colonial managers typically provided minimal protection against these environmental hazards, viewing them as natural conditions that indigenous workers should inherently withstand, rather than occupational risks requiring mitigation. This neglect of environmental dangers reflected the broader colonial mindset that viewed indigenous creating widespread famine when harvests failed. The spices that added flavor to European dishes quite literally came at the cost of starvation for those who produced them, a price invisible to consumers who saw only the final product without the mortality rates from accidents. Silicosis and tuberculosis far exceed those in comparable European operations. Yet these deaths are treated as routine operational costs rather than preventable tragedies. The migrant labor system that supplied these mines created additional suffering, forcing workers to live in single-sex compounds separated from their families, creating conditions where disease spread rapidly and social support systems collapsed, multiplying the physical dangers. Medical records from colonial companies show quinine reserved exclusively for European staff, creating a two-tiered health system where prevention of deadly disease became a racial privilege rather than a universal right. This selective application of life-saving medicine epitomized colonial logic. Indigenous lives were expendable inputs. While European management required protection and care, machete accidents during harvesting created constant injuries that frequently became infected in the hot, humid conditions. The geographical and cultural distance between European consumers and colonial workers facilitated extreme exploitation. The rubber, sugar, spices, and minerals that enhanced the European overseer casually explains the company policy. Workers who do not collect their assigned amount of rubber have their hands amputated as a lesson to others. Children with missing limbs stand as grim testimony to this practice. While armed guards ensure no one escapes into the surrounding forest, sugar's economics required maximizing production during the short harvest season, creating frenzied 18-hour workdays that increased accident rates through fatigue. The industry's seasonal nature also meant workers were routinely pushed beyond human endurance during harvest, then left without income during off-seasons, cycle that physically debilitated even those who survived the immediate dangers. The mortality rates here approach those of the deadliest battlefields. Yet these deaths occur not in the chaotic violence of war, but in the coldly calculated exploitation of colonial commerce. Colonial extraction economies created unprecedented combinations of deadly conditions. European living standards were produced through labor conditions so brutal that few Europeans could have witnessed them without moral objection. One mainstream historical fact that highlights colonial labor exploitation was King Leopold II's rubber collection system in the Congo Free State. Rubber system, as it became known, represented perhaps history's most explicit case of profit-driven mass killing. With every aspect of the operation designed to extract maximum production regardless of human cost, sugar plantations created particularly deadly combinations of hazards. You're touring a Caribbean sugar operation circa 1750, observing how every stage of production endangered workers. Processing phase introduced new dangers. Workers around the crushing mills regularly lost limbs to unguarded machinery, while those tending the boiling houses endured extreme heat and risks of catastrophic burns from splashing liquid. A particularly quirky tidbit about colonial labor involves the health paradox of quinine workers. Prior to effective malaria prevention, tropical regions remained limited in their exploitation potential, as European overseers frequently died from disease. The mining operations established under colonial rule combined extraordinary physical dangers with calculated exploitation. You're descending into a colonial-era gold mine in South Africa, where indigenous workers labor in conditions that European miners would have found unthinkable. With psychological and social devastation, the spice plantations that supplied European markets combined surprising dangers with systematic exploitation, not understanding its human cost. Historians still argue whether colonial labor regimes represented exceptional brutality or merely the most extreme expression of industrial capitalism is logic. By countervailing social forces, the environmental conditions in many colonial operations multiplied the inherent dangers of industrial work. Populations as naturally suited to hardships that Europeans considered unbearable. Racist rationalization that justified providing minimal protection while demanding maximum output. The enduring legacy of colonial labor exploitation extends into modern global supply chains to facilitate occupational suffering that would likely generate outrage if visible to end users. You're walking the cholera-infested wards of a London hospital in 1854, following Dr. John Snow as he tends to patients while developing his groundbreaking theory about waterborne disease transmission. Unsung medical martyrs surround you in this makeshift ward where nurses and doctors work without understanding the microscopic enemies they face. Neither wears gloves or masks. Such precautions won't become standard for decades. The hospital chaplain moves from bed to bed, offering last rites to the dying, unwittingly carrying bacteria on his hands from patient to patient. Before germ theory revolutionized medicine, healthcare itself was often a deadly profession. With mortality rates among medical workers during epidemics sometimes exceeding those in the general population they were trying to save, you're examining the iconic plague doctor costume with its bird-like mask filled with aromatic herbs provided no actual protection against Yersinia pestis bacteria, instead giving its wearers false confidence while they directly expose themselves to infected patients. Medieval medical ethics demanded that physicians remain at their posts during epidemics, creating a professional expectation of self-sacrifice that continued throughout medical history. You're observing a 17th century anatomy lesson where medical students and their professor examine a cadaver without gloves, masks, or other protective equipment. You're watching a medieval doctor carefully sample a patient's urine, noting its sweetness, bitterness, or other taste characteristics. This diagnostic technique, practiced for centuries before chemical urinalysis became available, directly exposed physicians to whatever pathogens patients carried. And assistants are covered in blood spray, bone fragments, and aerosolized tissue from the procedure. Without understanding of blood-borne pathogens, surgeons routinely operated with bare hands, often having multiple open cuts themselves from previous procedures. You're accompanying a 19th century midwife as she moves between patient homes, assisting difficult deliveries without changing clothes or washing her hands between cases. Practices that would become standard until later. Understanding of infection transmission. Puerperal fever spread rapidly through these attendance practices, often claiming both patients and eventually the midwives themselves as they contracted the streptococcal infections they unknowingly transmitted. Medical practice clearly operated without crucial microbiological understanding until the late 19th century, creating genuine knowledge gaps about disease risks. However, documented resistance to Semmelweis's hand-washing protocols and later reluctance to adopt masks, gloves, and other protective equipment suggests institutional factors also played important roles. You're comparing exposure patterns between physicians, nurses, and support staff, finding that those with less authority typically shouldered greater practical exposure. Hospital nurses spent far more time in direct patient contact than consulting physicians, while orderlies and cleaning staff handled contaminated materials with the least protection and training. These frontline workers, predominantly women and lower socioeconomic groups, suffered disproportionate infection rates while receiving less recognition for their sacrifices. Most poignantly, many continued working despite severe psychological distress, their professional ethos demanding they prioritize patient needs above their own mental health until they reached breaking points from which recovery became impossible. Retracing how healthcare worker infections often provided crucial evidence that advanced medical understanding. Semmelweis developed his hand-washing protocols by observing physician mortality patterns. This grim progression, where each generation of healthcare workers faced slightly fewer risks, thanks to lessons learned from their predecessors. Casualties represents a form of professional evolution purchased at tremendous human cost, while numerous infectious disease breakthroughs came through studying healthcare workers who contracted diseases from their patients. The modern infection control practices that protect today's medical practitioners were literally written in the blood of their predecessors, whose sacrifices. Medical histories typically documented physician deaths while leaving countless nurses, orderlies, and support staff as anonymous casualties. Creating historical, the truth appears to combine both elements. Initial casualties stemmed from knowledge limitations, while later deaths increasingly reflected professional traditions. Economic constraints. What makes these deaths particularly tragic is that many occurred just as Ignaeus Semmelweis, and others were identifying hand-washing as a crucial preventive measure. Knowledge. That you're reviewing journals and letters from medical practitioners during major epidemics, finding evidence of profound psychological trauma from witnessing mass suffering while feeling powerless to help. The emotional toll of losing patients despite one's best efforts, combined with constant exposure to death and disease, created rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among medical workers that far exceeded general population averages. These indirect casualties, practitioners who survived infection but succumbed to psychological consequences of their work, represent an often overlooked category of medical, the introduction of surgical anesthesia in the mid-19th century, while revolutionizing patient care, actually increased surgeon risk by enabling longer, more complex procedures with greater exposure to patients' blood and tissues. Surgical mortality was so common that many practitioners developed fatalistic attitudes, viewing occupational infection as an inevitable professional risk rather than a preventable hazard. The surgical specialties consequently suffered some of the highest urine tasting represented. Just one of many sensory diagnostic methods that created intimate contact with bodily fluids. Doctors also commonly tasted blood sputum and other excretions, smelled wounds for signs of particular infections, and physically handled infectious materials as standard practice. These diagnostic approaches reflected admirable dedication to patient care while inadvertently creating extraordinary occupational exposure. That cadavers frequently carried infectious diseases that had caused the subject's death, while decomposition created additional biological hazards. Dissection wounds, cuts received while handling contaminated human remains frequently led to infections that claimed medical students' and anatomists' lives. Particularly dangerous was anatomist's tubercle, a form of tuberculosis infection contracted through skin cuts during dissection of TB-infected cadavers. These education-related deaths represent a particularly poignant category of medical martyrdom. Practitioners who died not while treating patients, but while attempting to advance medical knowledge through hands-on learning. This combination of ethical obligation and inadequate protection made medical practice during epidemics effectively a suicide mission for many. Pre-modern healthcare workers. A young physician examines a patient's evacuations with bare hands, unknowingly transferring the deadly bacteria to his own mouth, when he later wipes sweat from his face. Nearby a nurse holds a convulsing child, the patient's vomit soaking her uniform as she provides what comfort she can. The pre-germ theory era created perfect conditions for healthcare worker casualties. You're examining medical practices from ancient times through the 19th century, Observing how physicians, nurses, midwives, their dedication to healing created constant, intimate contact with infectious materials, while their lack of microbiological understanding meant they rarely took effective precautions. Most devastating was their inadvertent role as disease vectors, unknowingly carrying pathogens from sick patients to those who might otherwise have remained healthy, creating the tragic irony of healers sometimes spreading the very diseases they sought to cure. And other healers routinely exposed themselves to infectious diseases without understanding the mechanisms of transmission. Medical practitioners physically examined infected wounds, cleared airways of diphtheria patients, assisted childbirth in women with puerperal fever, and drained abscesses, all without protective equipment. One mainstream historical fact that highlights medical workers' vulnerability was the extraordinarily high mortality among plague doctors during the Black Death and subsequent outbreaks. Historical records documenting how physicians attending plague victims died at rates far exceeding the general population. In some outbreaks, more than 50% of medical practitioners perished. The introduction of anatomical dissection into medical education created new occupational hazards. A particularly quirky tidbit about historical medical hazards involves the urine tasters, physicians who diagnosed diseases by tasting patients' urine, claimed countless medical lives. Early surgeons faced particularly gruesome occupational hazards. You're observing a pre-anesthesia amputation where the surgeon mortality rates within medicine, with hospital gangrene, septicemia, and tuberculosis claiming many practitioners in their prime. The midwives and birth attendants who cared for women in childbirth faced their own constellation of deadly exposures, spread slowly and unevenly, leaving many practitioners still working without this basic protection despite its proven effectiveness. Historians still argue whether healthcare worker casualties primarily reflect genuine ignorance about disease transmission or institutional resistance to implementing known safeguards. You find evidence supporting both interpretations and institutional inertia that delayed implementation of known safeguards. Institutional hierarchies within medicine created uneven risk distribution among healthcare workers. Records that underrepresent the true scope of healthcare worker mortality, while obscuring its unequal distribution across professional hierarchies. The psychological burden carried by healthcare workers created additional casualties through suicide and substance abuse, martyrdom. The legacy of these medical martyrs extends beyond their individual sacrifices through the knowledge gained from their experiences and deaths, identified risks, and validated protective measures through their own suffering and deaths. You're standing in the crowded laboratory of a 19th century industrial chemist, watching as he casually handles arsenic compounds with bare hands, occasionally bringing his contaminated fingers to his mouth while deep in thought. Chemical pioneer's sacrifice unfolds before you as the man interrupts his work for a coughing fit. Most tragic is the pride he takes in the stains on his hands, the burns on his arms, and the chronic respiratory symptoms he experiences, all viewed as badges of professional dedication rather than warning signs of fatal exposure. Throughout the laboratory, assistants work with mercury, lead cyanide, and countless other toxic substances, creating innovations that will eventually improve countless lives while simultaneously destroying their own, bringing up blood-tinged sputum that he dismisses as a minor cold. Despite its recurrence for months, Pierre and Marie Curie's groundbreaking work with radioactive elements led to their premature deaths from conditions now recognized as radiation poisoning. These scientific martyrs established the foundations of modern chemistry through work that systematically destroyed their own health, creating a paradoxical legacy where their discoveries eventually saved countless lives while claiming their own. His yellowed skin and thinning hair tell a different story. This brilliant innovator is slowly visiting an early synthetic dye factory where workers develop vibrant new colorants through largely experimental processes. Without understanding carcinogenic mechanisms, they handle aromatic amines and other compounds now. You're visiting Alfred Nobel's laboratory, where work with nitroglycerin and other unstable compounds regularly resulted in devastating accidents. From Robert Boyle's work with phosphorus to Humphrey Davy's inhalation of various gases, the founders of modern chemistry frequently served as their own test subjects. The chemists and engineers developing these materials worked through dangerous trial and error processes, each explosion providing data points purchased with human lives. The development of each new polymer, from celluloid to PVC to polyethylene, involved experimental exposure to substances whose long-term effects remained unknown. Many of the chemists and technicians who created these revolutionary materials later developed rare cancers and immune disorders that would not be formally connected to their occupational exposures until decades later. You find evidence supporting complex conclusions. Some exposures occurred before hazards could reasonably have been anticipated, representing genuine knowledge limitations rather than negligence. You're visiting an early pharmaceutical laboratory where researchers test potential medicines on. The scientists synthesizing new compounds frequently served as their own first test subjects, exposing themselves to substances with unknown effects in hopes of developing treatments for disease. You're analyzing letters, journals, and memoirs from industrial. This practice of self-experimentation led to numerous casualties among pharmaceutical researchers, from acute poisonings to long-term health effects from chronic exposure to active compounds. Many expressed an almost religious devotion to scientific progress, viewing personal sacrifice as justified by potential benefits to humanity. The gradual development of laboratory hoods, personal protective equipment, exposure limits, and handling protocols emerged directly from observed casualties, creating a body of safety knowledge literally written in the blood of earlier practitioners. Modern chemistry students work in environments unrecognizably safer than those of their intellectual ancestors, protected by practices developed through generations of painful experience. This progressive improvement, where each cohort of chemical workers faced slightly fewer risks thanks to lessons learned from their predecessors. Suffering represents a form of disciplinary evolution purchased at tremendous human cost. Others described competitive pressures in fast-moving fields, where taking time for safety precautions might mean losing priority for important discoveries. Perhaps most significant was the professional identity built around stoicism and hands-on engagement, where direct contact with dangerous substances became a mark of authentic scientific practice rather than unnecessary risk. These cultural factors created a scientific environment that not only accepted but sometimes celebrated the very exposures that ultimately killed many of its most brilliant practitioners. The medications that revolutionized human health, antibiotics, anesthetics, analgesics, and countless others, often claim the health or lives of their developers through this process of embodied research, where scientists use their own physiological responses as data points. Others continued long after preliminary evidence suggested dangers, reflecting a scientific culture that valued breakthrough over safety. The truth appears to combine both elements. Initial casualties stemming from knowledge limitations, with later exposures increasingly reflecting professional traditions that celebrated risk-taking and hands-on experimentation. Even when theoretical caution might have suggested more protective approaches, the synthetic materials that transformed modern life, making everything from medical devices to consumer products more affordable and accessible, came with a hidden cost in the lives of their developers. What's particularly striking is how many continued this hazardous work even after witnessing colleagues die in accidents. Their commitment to innovation is outweighing even the most visceral demonstrations of their research's dangers. This pattern of continued risk-taking despite direct experience of fatal consequences characterizes many chemical pioneers, reflecting both remarkable courage and a professional culture that normalized extreme danger, who suffered liver damage, neurological disorders, and various cancers from their constant exposure. What makes these sacrifices particularly poignant is how the vibrant colors they created, the bright yellows, blues, and reds that transformed fashion and consumer products, often physically stained their skin, literally marking them with the chemicals slowly killing them, using their bodily reactions to understand chemical properties in ways that sometimes proved fatal. You re-observing a chemist identify a newly synthesized substance by placing a small amount on his tongue, a common practice before modern analytical techniques became available. This sensory approach to poisoning himself through daily exposures that will eventually claim his life. Frederick Acum, an important food safety pioneer, routinely tasted the very adulterants and contaminants he was working to eliminate from the food supply. Carl Wilhelm Scheele similarly tasted many of his discoveries, including hydrogen cyanide. Its practice of using one's own senses as analytical instruments reflected both the limited technology available and a professional ethos that valued direct experience over theoretical caution. The birth of modern chemistry created unprecedented occupational hazards. You're re-examining how the transition from alchemy to scientific chemistry in the 17th and 18th centuries established systematic experimentation with increasingly dangerous substances. Unlike many industrial workers who remained ignorant of what was killing them, chemists often recognized their occupational dangers, but accepted them as necessary professional risks. This combination of knowledge and acceptance created a uniquely informed self-sacrifice, where scientists knowingly exposed themselves to harmful substances in pursuit of discovery. One mainstream historical fact that highlights chemistry, its deadly nature, was the extraordinary rate of chronic illness and premature death among early industrial chemists. You're reviewing biographies of pioneering 19th century chemists, finding patterns of mysterious ailments, strange symptoms, and deaths in their 40s and 50s that stand out even by the standards of an era with shorter life expectancies. Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who discovered oxygen, chlorine, and numerous other elements, died at 43 from what was almost certainly cumulative chemical exposure. The practical development of industrial chemicals created particularly devastating exposures. Known to cause bladder cancer at extraordinary rates, the beautiful aniline purple that revolutionized textile dyeing came at the cost of the health and lives of these chemical pioneers. A particularly quirky tidbit about early chemical research involves the practice of taste testing new compounds. Chemistry created extraordinary risks, as researchers literally ingested unknown substances to characterize their properties, The development of explosives and propellants created a particularly deadly chemical specialty. Nobel's own brother Emil died in a nitroglycerin explosion at their factory in 1864, one of many casualties in the development of modern explosives. The plastics revolution of the early 20th century introduced new categories of chemical hazards. You're touring an early bakelite manufacturing facility, where workers handle formaldehyde and phenol with minimal protection, developing the world's first fully synthetic plastic through processes that expose them to potent carcinogens and respiratory irritants. Historians still argue whether chemical pioneer sacrifices represent necessary steps in scientific progress or preventable tragedies resulting from inadequate precautions. The pharmaceutical industry created its own category of chemical martyrs, themselves before wider trials. A common practice in drug development well into the 20th century. The psychological factors driving chemical pioneers' risk-taking reveal important aspects of scientific culture. Chemists finding recurring themes that help explain their willingness to endanger themselves. The legacy of these chemical pioneers extends beyond their specific innovations. 2. The safety practices their sacrifices eventually inspired. You're reviewing how occupational health standards in chemistry evolved largely through documented patterns of illness and death among researchers and workers. You're re-sitting in on a contentious 1911. Legislative hearing where industry representatives argue passionately against proposed factory safety regulations, claiming they would make American businesses uncompetitive with foreign manufacturers. The workplace safety revolution you re-witnessing represents the culmination of centuries of suffering finally confronted through organized resistance and regulatory intervention. Just weeks earlier, Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire claimed 146 workers' lives when they found themselves trapped behind locked doors during a blaze. A preventable tragedy that finally galvanized public opinion. As family members of the victims silently display photographs of their lost loved ones, legislators face a stark choice between economic arguments and the human cost of unregulated industry. What makes this moment particularly significant is you're reviewing occupational fatality statistics from the early 20th century United States. Discovering that workplace accidents killed approximately 35,000 workers annually, a death toll exceeding American losses in many wars. Injury rates were even more. You're comparing approaches between different industrial nations. Noting how initial workplace safety efforts relied primarily on employer goodwill and market forces, with its place in the larger arc of occupational safety history, these numbers represented not abstract statistics, but a massive population of breadwinners whose deaths and disabilities created ripple effects through families and communities. Companies like U.S. Steel pioneered these shock campaigns, displaying photographs of actual workplace accidents alongside slogans like "This man did and follow procedures."
What?
Or "He forgot just once." These early safety communications reflected a fascinating transitional mentality. Organizations beginning to acknowledge responsibility for preventing accidents, while still emphasizing worker behavior rather than engineering controls or management systems. You're re-reviewing how early safety advocates had to demonstrate that prevention costs less than accidents. A calculation that initially focused on direct costs like compensation payments and production disruptions. Pioneering safety engineer H.W. Heinrich developed influential models in the 1930s, showing that indirect accident costs typically exceeded direct costs by a 4-to-1 ratio, creating financial arguments for prevention that even profit-focused managers could embrace. 2 machine guards in factories were implemented only after workers refused to continue under dangerous conditions, making worker resistance an essential catalyst for progress that official histories sometimes overlook. You find evidence supporting both interpretations, with the balance varying across different periods and regions. This dual foundation helps explain why safety advances have proven relatively durable compared to other social reforms. They align both ethical imperatives and financial interests, creating multiple motivations for maintenance, even when public attention shifts elsewhere. You're examining current occupational health statistics, finding dramatic improvements in traditionally hazardous industries like mining, manufacturing, and construction in. Yet new occupational hazards continue emerging. Psychosocial stresses, nanoparticle exposures, repetitive strain injuries, and other modern dangers that safety systems developed for traditional industrial hazards sometimes struggle to address. Most concerning are persistent global inequalities, with workers in developing nations facing risks that would be considered unconscionable in wealthier countries. These ongoing challenges remind us that workplace safety is not a problem solved, but an unfinished revolution. The weight of these countless unnamed workers' stories, their suffering, sacrifices, their slow path toward protection, creates not despair, but a quiet appreciation for how far we've come. Each generation of workers faced fewer hazards than those before them. Each safety innovation preserved human potential that would otherwise have been lost. The humble safety rail, the respiratory mask, the machine guard. These simple protections represent not just technical solutions, but moral victories, each one purchased through hard. Your breathing naturally slows as you consider how many dangers that once seemed inevitable have been engineered away, regulated into history, or protected against. Their stories, though often absent from traditional histories, form an essential thread in human progress, not the celebrated innovators and leaders, but in how we value and protect each human life contributing to our shared journey. Sweet dreams. But the ordinary people whose daily labor and ultimate sacrifices built our modern world, as a continuing struggle to ensure that economic progress doesn't come at the expense of those whose labor makes it possible. The same ingenuity that created these industrial processes eventually turned toward making them safer. The same societies that once accepted worker deaths as inevitable gradually recognized them as preventable tragedies. This capacity for moral and practical evolution offers hope not just for workplace safety, but for addressing all forms of suffering we currently accept as necessary or inevitable. Early reforms often emerge from genuine moral outrage at worker suffering, particularly following highly publicized disasters that captured public attention. And later improvements increasingly reflected sophisticated cost-benefit analyses demonstrating safety's economic advantages. The truth clearly combines both this economic reframing, shifting safety from moral obligation to business. Advantage proved crucial in overcoming resistance from industries that had long considered accidents an inevitable cost of doing business. The protective equipment warning signs, engineering controls, and safety procedures that modern workers often take for granted or even find cumbersome stand as memorials to those who died without such protections. Their sacrifices, gradually transforming workplace dangers from accepted inevitabilities to preventable tragedies. This transformation, incomplete but substantial, represents one of humanity, its most significant yet often unrecognized moral achievements. The radical assertion that economic progress need not and should not require human sacrifice, that the value of worker lives outweighs the convenience of dangerous shortcuts, and that the true measure of industrial advancement includes not just what is produced but how safely it is created. By demonstrating that safety could enhance rather than undermine profitability, reformers found allies among forward-thinking. The graphic approach reflected emerging understanding that emotional impact, rather than rational argument alone, was necessary to overcome entrenched habits and attitudes toward workplace risk. You're comparing working conditions between regulated Western factories and their less protected counterparts in developing nations, noting how hazardous industries often migrated toward regions with minimal safety requirements. This regulatory arbitrage, where production follows the path of least regulation, created a race to the bottom that undermined safety standards globally. The most dangerous industries today often operate in regions with limited enforcement capacity, creating modern versions of the hazardous conditions that previous generations of workers fought to eliminate in developed nations. This pattern reveals how workplace safety remains. It's fundamentally connected to power relationships and economic structures rather than merely technical knowledge or regulatory frameworks, with genuine protection requiring not just rules on paper, but mechanisms for worker voice and effective enforcement. The economic consequences of this carnage, orphaned children requiring public support, disabled workers unable to support themselves, creating the first national system that both compensated injured workers and incentivized accident prevention. Other nations gradually followed this regulatory model, though with significant variations in timing and comprehensiveness. The United States lagged notably behind European counterparts, with federal workplace safety regulation not comprehensively established until the Occupational Safety. You re-attending a coal miners' union meeting where workers discuss refusing to enter mines without adequate roof supports? One of countless examples where collective action achieved safety improvements when regulations and management concern proved insufficient. Particularly important were wildcat safety strikes, work stoppages initiated by workers themselves when faced with imminent dangers, bypassing both management and sometimes their own union leadership. These direct actions forced immediate responses to hazardous conditions while demonstrating workers' growing unwillingness to accept safety risks as inherent job requirements. The Historical and Health Act of 1970, nearly a century after initial European mandates, experienced employees lost from the workforce, eventually created practical arguments for safety that complemented moral concerns and helped overcome industry resistance. Not an isolated reform, but part of a fundamental shift in how societies balance profit motives against worker protection. After centuries where occupational deaths were considered unfortunate but acceptable costs of progress, this emerging revolution represents a radical assertion that worker lives should not be sacrificial inputs in economic equations. The workplace safety movement emerged from multiple converging forces. You're examining how organized labor, progressive reformers, investigative journalism, examining workplace safety posters from the early 20th century, and scientific research combined to challenge the long-standing acceptance of occupational hazards. What distinguished this movement from earlier isolated reform attempts was its comprehensive approach addressing not just specific hazards, but the underlying power imbalances and economic incentives that had normalized dangerous working conditions across industries. Labor unions documented workplace dangers and demanded protections, while muckraking journalists like Upton Sinclair exposed horrific conditions to middle-class readers previously unaware of how their consumer goods were produced. Medical researchers established scientific connections between specific exposures and health outcomes, while progressive-era reformers built political coalitions to translate this evidence into regulatory action. One mainstream historical fact that catalyzed safety reforms was the sheer scale of workplace casualties during industrialization, staggering, with an estimated 2 million workers suffering disabling injuries each year. When workplace safety movements gained momentum, the transition from voluntary to mandatory safety measures marked a crucial turning point. Predictably limited results. Germany pioneered the shift toward government-mandated protections with Chancellor Otto von Bismarck's introduction of workers' accident insurance in 1884. A particularly quirky tidbit about workplace safety evolution involves the Safety First movement's use of macabre visual propaganda, noting their gruesome imagery of mangled bodies, severed limbs, and grieving families. Visual messaging that would be considered too disturbing for modern workplaces. The economic arguments that eventually supported safety reforms reveal important shifts in industrial thinking. Business leaders who began viewing accident prevention as sound financial strategy rather than merely regulatory compliance. Worker activism played a crucial role in driving safety improvements. Record shows that many crucial safety innovations, from improved ventilation in mines. Historians still argue whether workplace safety improvements primarily reflect humanitarian concerns or economic calculations. Elements. Moral concerns creating initial pressure for change, with economic justifications providing the practical arguments needed to overcome resistance and sustain improvements. The globalization of production created new challenges for workplace safety movements. The ongoing nature of the workplace safety revolution reflects both progress made and challenges remaining. Developed nations, with fatality rates declining by over 90% from their historical peaks. As you reflect on the countless lives sacrificed across centuries of dangerous occupations, you recognize that each safety improvement, each protective regulation, each hazard eliminated represents not just abstract progress, but specific human suffering avoided. As your journey through history's deadliest occupations comes to a close, you feel a gentle calm settling over you. There's something deeply reassuring about this gradual arc of progress, however imperfect and incomplete it remains. Lessons, and often at terrible cost. Let your mind drift now towards sleep, carrying with you not the horrors of these forgotten occupations, but the profound human capacity for change. Rest easy in the knowledge that your understanding of these forgotten workers honors their memory. You drift toward dreams. Let their legacy remind you that real progress isn't measured merely in production or profit,